This is the Community and Economic Development Committee. I'm John Weddleton.
Dick Crane.
Forrest Dunbar.
Felix Rivera.
Ryan Yell, Planning Department.
Andy Honest, Clerk's Office.
Francis McLaughlin, Planning.
Megan Bosky.
Pete Peterson.
Go ahead and do your names.
Oh, Aaron Ralph, Alaska, Kansas.
Sue Nolan, Walker Fireweed.
Jim Kubitz, Alaska Railroad.
Karen Hall, Port of Anchorage.
Steve Rebuffalo, Port of Anchorage.
Jim Jager, Port of Anchorage.
Sharon Ferguson, Planning Department.
Kyle Hatton, A.K. Ryan, Cape Rock.
Dave McConnell, A.K. Ryan, A.K. Frost.
Janelle Dean, Chamber Hillside.
Kate Ensker, Hillside Natural Wells.
All right, thanks. So we have agenda here. I would like to flip the order of the marijuana thing. Not for any huge reason, but everybody's here. Is that everybody's here for the for marijuana? Does that work for everyone else? Any objection? Okay. Anything else on the agenda? And for port, it'll probably take us an hour, 50 minutes to get through the marijuana stuff. You guys want to take a break? Hang out. Okay. Okay, so let's start with Alaska Rhyme. Is that okay? And that is
Sean, Alaska Rhyme, my guest for this.
Oh, am I eight?
Oh,
Good for you.
okay, there was room.
Take my seat.
I thought it was last time.
We saw you were late. So
It was.
You sit there, Aaron? That's fine. It was.
Okay, Matt, you want to go through the license?
AK Rhyme, they had all of their licensing requirements addressed in their operating plan. There was no taxes, fees, or fines due. There was one deficiency that they addressed with a supplemental regarding the moisture and pest control, so everything has been addressed. And there was no extra recommended findings.
Okay. Any questions? Chucks?
Yep, okay. So the applicant, AK Rhyme LLC, is applying for a special land use permit for a marijuana manufacturing facility. It totals 432 square feet of space within an existing building. It also has permits for retail and cultivation. The proposed facility is within an I-1 district, generally located at the southwest corner of International and 8th Street. The petitioner has an approved cultivation license called Isidore and is currently working towards securing the manufacturing and retail in order to be vertically integrated. The petitioner has secured non-conforming rights for the lack of one type B loading berth, lack of pedestrian facilities, and lack of parking lot enhancement landscaping. The site meets the required number of parking spaces of 16 with one van accessible. Plans that were submitted require the applicant to provide visual enhancement landscaping along International, and the department is recommending a certification from an industrial hygienist or engineer to be resolved as a condition of approval. The planning department recommends approval of the special land use permit subject to the conditions that are stated in the staff report. The industrial hygienist certification, that's how we've been doing these, because usually they have to have their equipment set up in order to have them come inspect.
Just a moment. So you guys just came in?
Yes, sir.
Okay, who are you with?
We're with Tesoro. Good morning. Sorry.
Okay, sure, the report thing. Okay, I just want to make sure because we flipped the order for the marijuana stuff, so I want to make sure no one panics.
Oh.
You'll probably be 45, 50 minutes.
Okay.
So, no worries. Okay, any questions on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I'm looking at number 9 on page 2. It says they have to have a cost estimate for the 10% improvements. So, and why is it again that they have to do the improvements?
Well, they'll have to do the improvements if they exceed the 50% of the building value.
50% of the building value.
Yeah, and they've provided that with this incorporated, so that's a condition that they bring up.
Oh, okay. All right, thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Sean, can you talk about the video surveillance equipment?
What page you on, Amy?
On page 214. Are you guys planning on putting video equipment?
We already have it. Yes.
Yeah, that was with it. That was with it.
All three all three businesses are in one building. And so we have a huge video system before.
And the state's already signed off on what you have existing, correct?
Correct. Over 80% of the building is historic cultivation, and so the majority of our camera systems are already installed within functioning for months.
Well, I wanted to follow up on the, couple things. One thing, did you say 3,200 square feet or something? You
Yes.
said 700.
So, yes, unfortunately, on the staff report there, the very first, it's the 432 square feet. There was a typo there at the top that says 700.
Where is this?
My pages aren't numbered, but it's the staff analysis. So it's page 4
The staff report?
of the staff report. It says occupy 740 square feet of this building. However, in the parking analysis and elsewhere, it's only going to be 432 square feet.
Okay, so,
On the floor. What did you calculations? And that's also
what did I get this 740?
It's in the third line on page 414, John.
So it'll be right.
And so
Okay,
what's
so
it,
that's wrong.
340 or 440 or what was it?
432.
432.
So do you change staff report just to get it right, or what's it?
I don't know, Mandy, what that word.
We just need to specify in the ordinance, because that's the approving document.
Well,
Is it in there at all?
We really don't put that in there.
The clerk's office can do an AIM to address that issue.
Or we can just do it in the
Yeah, or you can do it.
my question is, so was this mistake made when you did the application for the state as well?
No, it's a
It's not there.
staff's mistake, yeah.
Yeah, in their application, it says 432.
Okay.
The only issue there is then if, if you change the size of your operation, you have to come back.
Yeah.
Mess around with all that. We don't want you to have to do that because it's a typo. So I think whatever you need to do to make sure that wouldn't happen. Even if it's a little while. So then, I had a question on this landscaping on condition 8. Yeah, it says do the landscaping, but on page 36 of this, they talk about they don't have to do that because you have already exceeded the 10% requirement.
We still had to bring, there was a house on property that we had to demolish to make additional parking. Once we did that, we had to take that area that the house actually occupied, we had to bring that up to conform with current code. So we do have an 8-foot planting bed there. We have an approved landscape plan with zoning. So it does conform. We're able to provide 17 spaces instead of 16 required. For redesign.
So the landscape requirement is triggered, that 10% limit doesn't apply because when you took down the house, for some space, you had to do some landscaping.
We created a new parking area, so the new parking area section of the lot.
Okay. So it was odd to me, I mean, it's good, it's outlined in the line permit, but then in the kind of tied in one here, your AK Frost, that wasn't discussed. Is that?
It's on the list of conditions, actually.
I believe it is.
Is it like
It has the same
the
condition.
discussion about how, the discussion of the limits on coming into conformity was not in the AK Frost?
Shall I address it? Yes, the landscape requirement, it's on the plat. So this goes back quite some time. It's for the front of the property that is along the street out there, International Drive. And so it looks like some landscaping has been put in there. I can't tell if it just sort of grew up on its own or it was actually planted, but they have to address that. And there's also a driveway remnant that is still there, and that should be removed.
Okay. And none of that, you exceeded the amount you needed to spend to come into conformity, but the landscaping stuff.
This aspect of the landscaping was never given non-conforming status because it was always supposed to be that it was in the plat.
All right, good. Anything else? A recommendation?
Thank you for
Jim Light's community counselor, and I attend the meetings, community councils. They know what's coming in there.
Okay. So I guess you've been through this. So we'll recommend at the Tuesday meeting, we'll recommend approval for this and then vote. So, oh, and also for people doing the marijuana, we rearranged Tuesday's agenda to put the marijuana stuff first on the public hearing because they tend to go pretty fast. But you're welcome to stay the rest.
You just spent the whole 3 hours.
Okay, so you want to stay up there for doing your AK process. Jan?
AK Frost, their licensing requirements were all addressed. There was no taxes, fees, or fines, obviously, because they didn't require. This one, there was no recommended conditions added to it, and there was no deficiencies.
Okay. Sarah?
Yes, this case is for AK Frost. It's the retail portion of the store. It was mentioned earlier, there's a building, one existing building, and it will have both a marijuana cultivation, a manufacturing, and a retail component. And this one is for the retail component. The retail will occupy 740 square feet of the building. They did have a meeting with the Taku Community Council on May 12th at the Diamond Center Hotel, where the businesses presented, all 3 businesses at the same time. And I think we've already discussed most of the conditions for this, and they're very much the same from one business to the other. I just do want to point out that after, ours aren't numbered, but the section after the staff report, there's a photo of the site, and that is the frontage that we were talking about earlier in terms of the landscaping that needs to go in, and according to the plat, this was a plat requirement, and there's still a driveway remnant that's been there for I don't know how many years, but it should be removed so landscaping can go across there. It doesn't serve any function currently. And I also did want to point out, at the end of the packet, we did receive some comments from the public. It looks like it's 2 people that each submitted several comments. I just to point those out. They had some concerns about the proximity of this site with the Save High School, and Save High School is well outside the 500 feet. It's approximately 1,300 feet away. So I don't see any issue with that. That's all I have.
Thanks. Any comments? Okay. So some of these comments, the comments are parallel. I mean, with Isidore and these 2, the public meetings you did covered all 3 correct? Yeah. Have you talked to these? I mean, basically your neighbors who are
This is Northern Meats. They're not really close to us. We do have a neighbor who has been kind of critical of it, but I don't think any of this is, we haven't engaged with Northern Meats.
We have the same comments as what is all.
Couple of comments from the same people.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to reach out and make friends with them.
Yeah.
You've been working on it. Is your cultivation going? Do you have plans to go now?
Yeah.
No troubles?
No, it's pretty quiet. Not a lot of people coming and going yet, so I'm just working.
Okay, any comments?
Do you have any problem with retail and the hotels that are going in there?
No, I've talked to the manager of the Crown Plaza right across the street. She has another one of those in that block, and they actually had a meeting. Our neighbor kind of set up a little bit of a trying to garner protest support. The guy from Microcom who was at that.
I know
Microcom. So Chuck had a little meeting at the Crown Plaza with the manager there and some of the local businesses to kind of, hash out opposition basically. And we haven't. I reached out to her and some of the other people that we know in here, and nothing really came of it other than Chuck. And he seemed. I mean, we talked to his staff and stuff all the time.
They're interested in what we're doing. We'll have a lot of out-of-state visitors. There's like 9 hotels within a mile of our operation. And they're kind of excited about something.
The High Regency's opening up soon too. But that area is building up, so it's nice to see you guys redoing that building. That building's derelict for a long time.
Yeah.
Recommendation, approval?
Second.
The opposite? Okay, good. Tuesday? Thank you.
The biggest problem is the tourists getting hit crossing the street.
I think we need to have maybe with this crosswalks. Then they're on their own.
Last set of cannabis exchange. Is there someone here for that? You guys get sit down here.
That would make sense.
Okay, and your name? Aaron Brown. You're Aaron. Mandy? We're going to do Alaska Cannabis Exchange. We're going backwards.
So Alaska Cannabis Exchange, their licensing requirements were addressed in their operating plan. There was no taxes, fees, or fines found due, and there was no extra conditions for them.
Oh, thank you. Yes, Alaska Cannabis Exchange, this is a cultivation facility. They have 12,400 square feet of gross leasable floor area. A floor plan is provided to you. The zoning review found that with non-conforming rights, they complied with all of the zoning requirements. There was one member of the public that provided 2 comments in opposition to this application. This is in an existing industrial building. Happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Okay, any questions?
Who's providing power to them? Chugach Electric?
I think it's CEA in that area.
CA's there? Is Phil here?
No.
We got an email. You and I.
Okay, what did he say?
He's out of town.
Okay.
He said they intend to use the facility. They've been working with us to identify their requirements. QGAS provided them with an estimate on March 7th. Once we receive authorization of payment, we will proceed with the work. So you could work with the CDA.
Good. Just make sure you got sufficient power that you're on.
Yeah, they came out.
Any questions?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So do you have to upgrade your electrical service?
Yes.
Thank you.
Why is a question on square footage? Because we've got 12,400 square feet of building on a 16,832 square foot lot. There's 3 lots, actually. It's one big metal building on 3 lots. Part of it's the RV. So at one point, this is page 4 of 12, and 3 of 12 that has those measurements. And then on page 32 of 209, different numbering, it says 3 lots combined are 28,272 square feet. Seems odd. That doesn't make sense. And then page 5 of 12 here, it says cultivation plus the RV, 18,653 square feet, which won't fit on a 16,832 square foot lot. Just
So-
one floor. So what's going on?
So I stand by the numbers that are in there, and I understand that it's confusing, but it has to do with the planning. You have one warehouse building that stretches over several lots, but the warehouse doesn't cover 100% of each of those lots. I think that accounts for the discrepancy between the size of the lots, the square footage of the building, the different tenants within the building that spans the different lots. But the numbers are correct, and there's a logic to the madness.
But it is 12,400 square feet of cultivation.
Yeah, yeah.
And the overall building is 18,653.
Yeah.
So that's correct. That's correct. And then the smaller lot, the 16,832, is that because their operation is on lots 1 and 2, and lot 3 is the RV? Is that not
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. 30 less than they generally would have, but then,
I believe the traffic engineer granted them a parking reduction of 5 spaces after. So, the code requires a certain number of parking spaces, but the traffic engineer may administratively reduce the number of required parking spaces if the applicant provides a parking utilization study and works with the traffic engineer. See, some businesses take more parking than what is required in code. Some take less, and those people who have less, it may be in their interest to sort of work with the traffic engineer to prove up that they don't need that many spaces. But it's studied very intensely by the traffic engineer before they grant a reduction in parking spaces.
okay, so they said you had 5 employees on duty while the RV place is open. So she said, okay, 1 spot for each employee. Okay. What if you have someone doing pickups and drop-offs, and visitors and inspectors?
That won't require a parking spot. We do have a bay. That isn't going to be a parking spot for them to do deliveries.
Or there's some space there, it's not parking.
So if you look at the building, we have some big overhead doors. There won't be able to be parking in front of those doors. So the parking in front of all the other solid parts of the building. We have a delivery bay. Then that's not necessarily a parking spot.
Okay, any questions?
I just have a comment. So one of the big issues we had in debate when we were first starting these laws is you recognize that your facility is within 1,000 feet of an elementary school, 940 feet to be exact. And the assembly chose to go against the Department of Law's recommendation to go under 1,000 feet to 500 feet. So if federal government comes in, you do recognize you're within that 1,000 feet buffer, potentially you could be shut down. I just want to make sure anytime I see an applicant less than 1,000 feet, I want to make sure on the record that you're advised that you're within that threshold of the federal government. We've been advised by the city's own Department of Law that that's basically the danger zone, and they recommended against allowing marijuana facilities within that buffer zone. You realize that, right?
Anything else? Yeah. So a recommendation?
Move approval.
Is there any opposition? Okay. Good. See you Tuesday. Okay, so the next one is Hillside Natural Wellness.
What was another one of
Hillside Natural Wellness, all of the licensing requirements were addressed in their operating plan. There was no taxes, fees, or fines due by any of the licensees or affiliates. There was one note that I just wanted to make sure it wasn't stated in the operating plan, but I'm sure you know that no one under 21 signs need to be posted. But other than that, no other recommended conditions.
Okay, thank you. So, Ryan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The applicant continued to Hillside Natural Wellness is applying for a special land permit for a marijuana retail sales establishment within the I-1 district. The proposed establishment will be occupying 1,070 square feet of a pre-constructed 4,756 square foot building. We're making some good progress on that building as well. This site is located northeast of the intersection of Co-op Street and East 88th Avenue. The proposed building will be located on Lot 31, with parking being located on both lots 31 and 30. The petitioner has received previous approval for a marijuana manufacturing facility, Glacier Extracts, that was approved on April 11th. The AR number on that is 2017-124. It's planned to be operating in conjunction with the retail sales establishment. Plans submitted to the planning department show a building that is compatible with nearby land uses and structures. Building facade and construction type make it similar
starting to get close to residential now. You know that's right where, especially when you have establishments. You have an R2 just to the northeast. I prefer seeing these in industrial. I like that, but there's always going to be a border, right? Where there's different transitions. That's exactly where you're going to probably have the majority of your complaints if there's complaints. Your model has been one that kind of intrigues me a little bit. So I'll be interested to see how it works. I don't expect to see riffraff down there, to be honest with you. But I just wanted to highlight that, just because it would probably be very helpful, be very proactive, and especially on that border.
Yes, agreed.
See, I'm full of all kinds of tidbits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I've noticed that several of the owners are doctors.
Yeah.
So are you planning to specialize in medical marijuana or different types of marijuana that might have medicinal qualities?
Well,
Right now, it's all adult use according to the state regulations. So inside the retail, we will not be discussing it as medicine or anything like that. The physicians in their own private practice, they can discuss it however they want it at one time. But in the retail establishment, no, we will not be discussing it.
but the genetics that the doctors are working with, and was it tissue grafting?
Tissue samples, tissue cultures is what it is.
So they are doing high CBD strains. One of the doctors has an epileptic son. I think we talked about that a little bit last time. And so that actually was treated in Colorado under Jarvis Bud strain. So they actually are trying to focus on like the high CBD medical, so that when and if a commercial medical marijuana system ever does come, they could do that, but then also offer a getting high centered.
We're going to offer a non-psychoactive option to the adult use market. So it's, even though we can't say it's a medicine right now, but that we're going to offer non-psychoactive options that are good for inflammation and stuff like that.
So you're going to sort of aim at a slightly different market share or whatever? Cool. Thank you.
Anything else? I guess any
Motion for approval.
motion for approval?
Second.
Opposition? Okay, good. See you once again Tuesday. Actually, just into this while we're on this topic. There are, this is, I guess, a little bit off agenda, but when we look through and we've got the licensing conditions and then even the staff conditions, some of these things, like we have been including this, say number 7 on sign, because it wasn't addressed in code. Now we've done all this licensing stuff, and these things are clearly in code. So should they be listed as conditions? Because the first thing is follow the code. So that makes it redundant. And it'd be nice to have as few as possible so that what are true conditions, like a landscaping issue or parking, those are highlighted. It's not buried in with 8 or 9 others that are redundant in code. This is something that we'll be heading towards. So streamline the conditions.
Correct, yeah. The sign condition number 7, this stat packet was finalized quite early, so it was even before April 11th when that last day was passed. So from now on, that signs advertising marijuana establishments may only be placed on the marijuana establishment's window or attached to the outside licensed premises. That applies to all marijuana establishments now. So this condition is no longer necessary and will just be addressed in the planning compliance checks.
So how about like the ventilation? We've got that well covered in code, don't we?
part of this discussion, was there was concern that some of the people potentially navigating this system weren't as familiar with navigating municipal Title 21 and whatnot. So the decision was made early on, some of the most important parts of code that we could see a potential, somebody making a mistake, they wanted them in the conditions. So it would be a quick, easy reference, just as they said. So yes, for us who understand Title 21 and who love it, live it, breathe it, it's, we can look at code all the time and say, oh, well, it's in code, but the whole point is to make it easier for the applicants to make sure they don't unnecessarily have a violation that they could avoid. So yeah, it's redundant to some extent, but it was intentionally done that way. Now the sign was different because we didn't have that covered, but it was some of the most common places where we could see conflict. That's where it was intentionally kind of called out as a condition.
Okay, any thoughts? Okay, I wouldn't mind it streamlined, but that's fine.
It seems like it's getting smaller.
Well, it should, because I think part of it is we put everything in that recent change. Okay. So we're done with the marijuana stuff really fast. Did anyone from the port leave because I told them to take 45 minutes?
No.
Okay. See how fast we go? Okay, so next up is AO 2017-74 for change in Title 21 about fuel tanks on port. And we have staff person here?
Yeah,
that's you. Okay. Do you want to talk about it?
I do.
First?
Yeah, the planning department has prepared an ordinance for the consideration of the assembly, and I have some prepared remarks walking through some of the history and pertinent information about the ordinance. So a building permit was submitted to improve an existing fuel tank at the Port of Anchorage. They discovered that it was not allowed because the new code requires fuel storage to be 1,000 feet from a residential zoning district and parks. The impact of the 1,000-foot separation requirement is shown on red on the map behind the chair there. There's a sort of a close-up map with a big wave of red. And that's about half of the fuel tanks at the port are within that red area. So that's what I'm speaking to right now. This rule has been in effect for 15 months since the new code became the only code, zoning code. Most improvements to the existing fuel tanks in the red area are not allowed in the new code. The applicant for the building permit has to seek a zoning variance. This is a high hurdle for a project because the approval criteria for a zoning variance is very hard to meet, and there are no guarantees that the variance would be approved. In addition to requiring 1,000-foot separation from residential districts, parks, schools, and hospitals for fuel storage in the I-2 heavy industrial district, the new code also requires a public hearing conditional use permit to be approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission. The zoning variance and the conditional use together take a minimum of 7 months to obtain approval. A variance takes 3 months, conditional use takes 4 months. Because of the public notification requirements, they cannot be processed concurrently at the same time. I need to stress again that neither process, the zoning variance or the conditional use, is guaranteed to give approval to upgrade a fuel tank, particularly the zoning variance, which is an unprecedented requirement for work that is the very core function of what the Port of Anchorage does. The new code creates a big problem for the port, as you can see, which stores 90% of South Central Alaska's gas, including gas delivered to J. Bear, Eielson, Ted Stevens International Airport. Moving the fuel storage tanks to a different location is not feasible and would create problems elsewhere. Under the old code, fuel storage was a permitted by right use in industrial districts. No 1,000-foot separation, no conditional use were required. They do have an important review, though, which is the building permit review, which includes fire review, structural review, also state, DEC, and Coast Guard have additional requirements. These reviews are conducted regardless of the zoning. The Planning Department recommends approval of this ordinance, which you may have before you, it's been laid on the table, which removes the 1,000-foot separation distance and reduces the conditional use permit to an administrative site plan review with 2 new standards of approval aimed at the Government Hill neighborhood's chief concerns, which are public health and safety and protecting view sheds and inlet and mountains. The next map, next to the one with the red, to the left there, yeah, go working across. The next map shows shows the effect of this ordinance. This is a compromise between the old code and the new code. This AO only affects the port. It does not change the zoning anywhere else in Anchorage. I can sort of walk through an explanation of that in just a moment. The zoning codes in Seattle, Tacoma, Boulder, Colorado, Asheville, North Carolina, and Juneau match with the old code, how the old code treats fuel storage in industrial zones. Fuel storage is a permitted by right use in those cities and no required separation distance. This is because city and state economies depend on industrial activity. Therefore, cities have created industrial sanctuaries. Few zoning regulations in industrial districts give more flexibility to companies. Seattle's zoning map is at the very end near the corner of the room there. It's kind of hard to see. I had trouble printing it on a larger scale. But Seattle's zoning map shows heavy industrial zoning adjacent to single-family residential. The West Seattle, for instance, is just like our Government Hill, and they allow fuel tanks as a by right use. You can see the zoning map on the wall. So the Planning Department is processing this proposed ordinance as a technical amendment directly to the Assembly because this is an issue, this issue is an unintended consequence of the new code, and the summer development season has already begun. I presented this ordinance to the Planning and Zoning Commission on April 10th, and they approved a motion stating that this is an unintended consequence of the new code, which should be taken straight to the Assembly. The chair of the commission said that if it was the intention of the new code to greatly restrict the existing area utilized by the port, then they would have explicitly discussed the impacts upon adoption. They did not recall discussing these impacts, and as such felt that it was not the intended outcome. I brought copies of the draft minutes from the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting if you would like to see them. Other comments from the commissioners included, quote, the new code basically made the port and the majority of the fuel tanks illegal. I don't think that it was the intent of the new code to restructure the way that the port operates. Another comment, requiring a conditional use permit for every new fuel tank or alteration of an existing one is not necessary. Our economy depends on the port. Still another comment, if Boulder and the People's Republic of Portland don't restrict fuel tanks, then why are we? We are more conservative than those cities. I presented this ordinance to the Government Hill Community Council on April 20th. They strongly oppose this ordinance. They don't want the new code to be amended. They wanted the 1,000-foot and the public hearing conditional use to remain in place. I brought copies of the resolution and letter from the Government Hill Community Council and set them over on the table there. I have some more stuff I can talk about, but I could also stop there and entertain questions from the committee if you'd like.
Dr. Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so we discussed when we switched over from old Title 21 to new Title 21 that there were going to be things that came up that we missed. There were going to be unintended consequences. Obviously, this is one of them. And so, you know, we may have to make changes to solve the problem because, like you said, there's no guarantee they're going to get, you know, by going to the zoning commission that they're going to be able to get what they need.
Thanks, Amy.
I have a couple questions. If Steve can come up, and I'm not sure if Sora wants to come up. I want to talk specifically about the upgrade to the tanks and what is being planned and your timeline, your hope.
The truck rack and
Okay, well, I'm speaking on behalf of Crowley now, so I don't have all of the specifics on it. As Francis mentioned, this came to light because Crowley approached the municipality for a petition to install a truck rack down within their terminal area, and that's when we noticed this was going to be a problem, and they have, according to the code, they have gone ahead and they've entered into the variance request process to do that. But it also gave us time to look at what the bigger implications of this would be going forward for anybody else, not only the folks within the red, but for anyone else who's interested in establishing a presence down the port. This adds at least a year to Crowley's timeline for completing that truck rack.
Okay, and for a lay person here, what's a truck rack?
Okay. It's a gasoline station in this industrial area down here. In this particular instance, the Department of Defense wanted a backup to the pipeline that now connects the Crowley terminal to the base. If something should happen to the pipeline or it's taken out of service for maintenance and the fuel deliveries still need to happen, the only other way to do it now is by truck. So this provides a capability to fill gasoline trucks.
That was what I envisioned. I just didn't know if that was right.
It's like a big gas station where the tube comes into the top of the truck and
exactly
fills
what
up
I
the
was
truck.
envisioning.
And this is Cape Blair, by the way,
Blair
from Tesoro. And Tesoro's got 2 truck racks on board now, and 3. That's right. Since you bought the Flint Hills refinery.
And a rail loading.
Yeah, and Delta Western has 1, so it's not an uncommon piece of industrial equipment that's required to conduct business on the fuel side.
So as users of the port, as tenants down there, can you guys talk to me a little bit about potential, the impacts of having this pass or not having this pass and what you see for your potential future needs?
I'll let you go first.
Thanks. So we look at this proposed ordinance as a good solution to the unintended consequence of the current Title 21. Because when we look ahead at the projects that we have scheduled for this summer, we have 2 safety projects that we have in mind that would one is putting some, and I have our engineer here who can help me with the technical aspects of this, but putting some fire foam on the piping, so it's a greater fire retardant, and so that needs to be replaced annually. We plan to do it this summer. It would be a modification to the current pipeline, but if we need to go through this conditional use permit and the zoning variance to be able to do that construction work, that would delay the safety modifications that need to happen.
So any safety upgrades all have to go through this process?
Yes.
That's just stupid. Okay.
And then we have another project that would take existing pipelines and replace them with an above-ground pipeline, again, so that we can have further maintenance and pipeline integrity inspections. So again, it's a safety issue that we need to replace that pipeline that runs from one tank farm to the other tank farm. But if we need to go through this process, that would further delay that process as well.
And did you want to add anything?
Just to elaborate a little bit, the modifications that we plan on making in the area just downhill from the Government Hills subdivision will increase the safety of that area, upgrading fire foam piping, bringing underground lines above ground, cleaning and abandoning underground lines, because one, it's risky. It's easier when you can see the piping and inspect it above ground. These are modifications that are industry recognized practices as we go forward into the future that are safer, there's less risk involved there. Also, even within that 1,000-foot radius tank, 1,002, I believe it is, getting its bottom replaced, and that's a normal procedure. That could happen anywhere down the line in the East Tank Farm. That's a normal standard. You clean and drain down the tank, take out the old steel on the bottom, weld in new. We don't have any plans for that right now, but that could be one of the things that we plan on doing in the future, just to preserve the integrity of the asset.
I would add just one other unintended implication for the students. As Francis mentioned, this area includes half the tankage of the port, but there are companies who don't exist within the establishment buffer, and now you've got an unfair competition predicament that you've created, because those that are outside the buffer get to behave normal. Everybody inside the buffer has these extra hurdles they have to go through in order to accomplish the same task.
And for Tesoro, that would mean that one of our tank farms is not included and one is. And so we would have different, so we would just have different conditions that we would need to meet, and again, to hit the same process.
You can address that directly.
I wanted to ask a question of the companies. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Cubits? Yes. Can you give me the railroad's position on this? Yes. I could read the letter, but I'd rather have it on the record. Ray Cardish said just read letters well.
Certainly. Well, our best friends and neighbors are the port down there, because we own a fair amount of property down there and have customers who have tanks on our property that do fit within this 1,000-foot thing. So we didn't even know about this until last week, that this was actually going on. It's going to affect some of our customers. So we certainly support this ordinance. We actually wanted it amended a little bit because we have another customer who isn't on the map there. It's called Suburban Propane, who's been a rubber customer for 60-70 years, who have bulk storage on our property. And if we do the measurement, they're going to be within the 1,000-foot thing also. So we kind of wanted the railroad amended, like all of our property. The railroad operations property are not subject to planning and zoning, but all of our tenant property that we lease out is. So that's what we came to the Cable Steam call, and we talked with Francis about it too. But I understand that may involve a new public notice if we were to, add us in there, and we don't want to stop this process. So my letter basically says we support this ordinance. Oh, by the way, we'd like another one come back that will also help our customers who are not covered and were not covered under the public notice.
Francis, would you see if we can modify this with the amendment we can put into this to accomplish what the railroad wants?
We could, but it's,
let me know.
Yeah, so I looked into that. The railroad is affected as well by these new code zoning regulations, and so the ordinance is before you. To add the railroad is very simple. It's just in the body that you define the railroad area. But the title says for the port. This ordinance is specifically addressing only the port. So to add Alaska Railroad as well to benefit from this ordinance, then that's a substantive change to the title and would require it to be reintroduced and delay it 2 weeks to your May 23rd meeting. Can I just say one more thing, which is an alternative would be to approve this on Tuesday or have the hearing on this and then to follow up with a process with a separate ordinance to address the railroad's concerns.
Would you do me a favor, check with DEH to make sure we can make the amendment into the text? We can't change the title, but we can change the text. So just check with DEH to see if that can.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't check with Dean, but I checked with D. Ennis and with Quincy Arms. So I checked with the municipality's law department, and they found that a change to the body requires a change to the title, which requires this to be reintroduced and delayed by 2 weeks. And that has impacts, I think, on the proposed project at the port. And what I'm hearing from the railroad is that they stand in support of the ordinance as written, but they don't have a pending project. They would like to see a follow-up ordinance to address their concern.
I'll check with Dean because Dean was the one that wrote most of the stuff for DNS, so let me check with Dean. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the same topic, but I have a question.
Mine might be a little bit different topic. I'm hopeful that the President and Community Council will be heard.
We can get to that.
And
we can.
Yeah.
We could maybe go to Amy then.
Yeah.
Get onto that.
But before that, on the previous topic, hearing that there are upgrades to tanks that might come or not, depending on what the rules are, the cost and time associated with achieving them, you hinted or got to the point that it seems like there's a perverse incentive here to not make safety improvements, if in fact it's going to take a year to get approval to make them. And so it just seems like this change is actually a safety improvement. But I want to hear from the council first.
Right.
So my question is, the Alaska Railroad property, are we talking about railroad property at the Port of Anchorage?
Yes. Yeah, we're neighbors there.
So can somebody show me on the map where your property is, or where that property is? We're talking about that Suburban Propane's located at?
Well, the blue, let me get this correctly, the blue property is controlled by the port. Everything this side of the blue is a railroad property. For instance, this entire tank farm here is, so is this one. Suburban is, as I said, it's off the map. If you go down Whitney Road here, they have a large installation on Whitney Road, and if you take the tape.
Whitney's down here. Whitney's down here.
Yeah, from where they are to the Government Hill development and stuff is within 1,000 feet now. So we have about 4 different locations where we do bulk loading on and off the railroad for suburban propane. So we looked at it, we were all focused on this, and all of a sudden we said, oh my God, I think this may affect suburban too. So that's why we want to be added. But I want to be clear, I don't want to muck this one up. If these guys really need this done, as long as we can come back and kind of add that too, we would be okay with that.
It only takes a few minutes for me to ask our attorney.
Exactly. I appreciate that.
So because of their location, I'm looking right at you, Steve, because of their location, they're technically not at the port.
Correct.
That's where I was trying to go, because I was like, if they're technically at the port, I was about to argue some lawyers. But
The petroleum users in the port area that are tenants of the railroad fall inside the big black line that you see over there. They are ratepayers to the port for use of the marine terminal facilities and the valve yard, and they also share in the cost of the security contract. Suburban Propane does not, but all of those petroleum terminals do. So we include them in our tenant base for security reasons.
I'm looking at Sharon. Well, I just want to clarify that the ordinance does address some of the railroad property, because the ordinance, if you read it carefully, says port security area. So it would cover all the railroad's properties within the black line.
Yeah, but not down there across the street.
Right, not down here, but it does cover the port security area, which does include the railroad for the bulk fuel tank.
Which I didn't realize till today, and that's great. We still have discussion.
Okay, well, and I know there'll be other comments to come, but I'll just sit and wait for those and make my comments again.
Can I just add one thing? As far as the safety goes, we would make these safety improvements anyway, regardless of the 1-year time frame. We are committed to safety. That's our core value of Tesoros. So we would make these, but we want to make them as soon as possible. Part of the reason that they're scheduled for the time that they are is because it's a needed time for improvement. And so I don't want you to leave here and think that because our timeline is adjusted that we wouldn't do these things. But I can't speak for Crowley or for anyone else, but for Tesoro, we would still make the safety improvements that need to be made. We would just want to make them as soon as possible because it is the right time to make them.
Thank you. So I don't envy your position on this, Chris. You're the one who has to go talk to the Government Hill Community Council. But it's literally in their backyard, and they don't want it, and we're familiar with that. And I think I would be in a similar position where this is East Anchorage, but it does seem like a fairly, I don't want to denigrate people that wrote the new code, but it does seem like a fairly major oversight. I don't think any of us intended to delay or shut down work in the Port of Anchorage is one of the largest economic centers in the city. And by the way, it's existed almost as long as a lot of those neighborhoods have existed. It's been there for decades and decades. So I guess my question for you, Francis, is, and we got to this with Jim's point about the additional railroad customer. I'm curious if there's any other major economic center like the airport or Merrill Field or anywhere else where we're going to have a similar kind of unintended consequences.
There may be. That hasn't been studied. The focus has been on addressing this situation which is affecting the port, which appears to be a pretty big oops in the new code.
Right. So I mean, I don't, echoing Mr. Kubitz, I don't want us to slow down and work on this. I think we need to move forward with this ASAP. But then, if we're looking at that railroad customer, maybe we should try to do a little bit broader survey and see if places like Merrill Field are also affected, and maybe we can try to get out ahead of some of these as well for the next ordinance.
More questions. On the map here, the yellow line doesn't include the western part of kind of the eastern section of the MI zone. What's the rationale for not including that in the yellow line? With the site review requirement?
Yeah, no, I understand your question. Okay, so there's two zonings within the port security area, marine industrial and I-2 heavy industrial. The 1,000-foot required separation from park, school, hospital, and residential district applies to the use of fuel storage. So that applies regardless of the zoning. So it applies in both the 1,000-foot requirement, separation requirement applies to both the MI zone and the I-2 zone. What this ordinance does is it removes that 1,000-foot separation requirement from the use. It just eliminates that for the port security area only. So that's what's on your maps there, right? The I-2 district has an additional restriction, which is this public hearing conditional use permit review by the Planning and Zoning Commission. And that doesn't apply in the new code to the MI marine industrial zone. It only applies to the I-2. So this ordinance, which is really a compromise, is aimed at reducing that conditional use review to an administrative site plan review with 2 new conditions of approval. It's a long way of answering your question that the conditional use only applies to the I-2 zone, and that's why you see it as being reduced to administrative site plan review. There is no public hearing currently in the new code in the MI zone.
A follow-up question on that. The 2 new standards of review, I've had them fed to me simply as viewshed and site plan review. What do those standards translate into? What does that mean?
Well, I mean, so there's an administrative site plan review process. I brought copies of both the process and the approval criteria, but adding 2 new approval criteria to review an application for fuel storage upgrade or a new tank to ensure that it doesn't disrupt view sheds from the neighborhood and that it doesn't create a public health hazard. That's what those 2 new standards are simply aimed at.
Is there in the Title 21 or some other document a place the public can review what those kind of reviews might entail, like for safety? Or for the view shed, it's something that doesn't go above X feet, or where can they get assurance of what that means? Because there isn't an opportunity for public input for those reviews, I believe.
Well, there's an opportunity for public input. There's just not a public hearing. So members of the public could call into planning department, could come to the counter and review the application, be online. There's a whole public notification process that I can explain. They can submit written testimony, but what they want and what they would not get with the proposed ordinance is a public hearing in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission to decide it. And so, the port is roughly 65 feet lower than the homes on the bluff on Government Hill. And so what the planning department would do is to look to the applicant to prove up that whatever their upgrade is or whatever their new tank would be, that it wouldn't block the view of the inlet in the mountains.
So that's the easy one, the view shed. So the tough one is how would the department review for safety that the public could understand and have a sense of what that means?
Sure. So an example of that is Crowley Company, which is one of the companies that owns the fuel tanks. They did an investigation of the safety of their tanks. It's a scientific study. I have it with me. We're going to have copies set out for you. And what that does is it explains what the hazard zone is. And it was less than 200 feet from the tanks that there's a danger. It sort of goes into explaining, so you have this tank and they have the fire suppression and the foam on site, and these tanks can't start on fire, but when they do these fire drills that they have to sort of make believe, because it's not possible actually to start a tank on fire. But what is possible is if there was some sort of a leak, or if there was some sort of penetration of the tanks then it floods out into an area, and then if there is a fire, an open fire on an area that includes this fuel, then who does that, where are the dangers? And so they have a map showing 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, and it's just a scientific study that proves up what are the hazard distances. And that would be something, fire department already has fire requirements when they review this. I talked with Cleo Hill and Mark Canillo in the Building Safety Division. They do a structural review and a fire review. So, we would have to come to some determination based on the evidence and whether or not it posed a public health hazard.
One last question. So, it's an interesting neighborhood if you contemplate its location relative to industrial uses. To the west, you have all of the port. To the north and the east, you have military installation. And then all around the south, east and west, you have the rail. And so I'm hearing now that, and I have heard, and I believe there's value that the port and that area is a reservation for industrial uses. Or sanctuary, I forget the exact term, but what then is the special protection given that neighborhood, which is uniquely positioned in all of Anchorage, that it is literally surrounded on all sides by explosives and poisons and heavy use, noise? Is there a specialized kind of sanctuary protection to the government-owned neighborhood? And if not, where do we start? Because those folks actually live and have invested and have been there since as long as the port, and deserve an equal measure of protection as does the port's industrial use.
So I think the question here is, are there protections built into the situations like this? And there are. There's already through the building permit process a fire review with international fire codes and local amendments dealing with separation distances between, we can't say generally carte blanche that this is what the separation distance is, because each improvement or each tank is studied by the fire department with uniquely, and whether or not it meets a separation distance from a public right-of-way or from a property line or from a residence that is safe. So that is studied. What the question before us is, how does the zoning code tread on this? And when you look at other communities like Seattle, Portland, Boulder, these other places, then you find that they match what the old code required, which was it was a permitted by right use. Of course, it required building permit, but the zoning code places no requirements on it. It's the new code that goes beyond what those other communities do. Now, I did research Denver, Colorado, and found that in their old code, they required a 500-foot zoning separation distance from residences and between a fuel tank and a residence, and a conditional use permit. But in their new code, they removed the conditional use permit. So they've actually lessened the restrictions that zoning places on it. But they do have this 500-foot separation. The tanks here that we're looking at are about 400 feet from some of the homes.
All right, so I guess my point, I think, that needs to be addressed at some point in the future on a separate question from this, because I think the answer to this is generally accepted, but I'd like to hear from Melinda, is that we do need to analyze this neighborhood as a body and come up with, if we're going to reserve as a protected area the industrial uses are all around it, that it needs also to have some special area of focus. Much like we have in Girdwood special zoning and in Eagle River. This area is unique among all of Anchorage.
Okay. Is the Government Health plan that was just done, was it discussed?
It doesn't address the issue of hazards from the board.
Is that any other questions? A couple of minutes. We'll give you a chance to speak.
A question for Francis, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Francis, you were talking about and applied to the Port of Anchorage security area, but I find that in the text, it's not in the title. In the title it says Port of Anchorage. It doesn't say the security area. So could we modify what this says to include the propane? Because we're not. I'm not talking about just the title, because you didn't adjust the title when you added security.
Yeah. So this is a similar question to what you asked before, and my response is this, that the language in this ordinance is just two phrases, right? It's very short, and it says port security area. All that needs to change is to add, the Alaska Railroad Depot area, and then this applies to them. The catch, though, is when I ask our law department, who is highly ethical and all that, does adding that phrase to this mean that the title has to change too? The mayor's legal, our lawyers say, yes, it does, and that's a substantive change that this ordinance needs to be reintroduced. If the assembly finds some way that that's not the case, then that's outside of my...
Well, thanks. We hired their attorney.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else? A couple questions, maybe someone is fine, but it says, so now the new code put the South put restriction on it, so a lot of tanks they say would now be illegal. But we've done, they certainly have non-conforming rights, so pretty much get it. So they can be there. And if you had a house that was within a new stream setback, that would increase. You could replace your roof, do repairs on your house. I mean, why are safety repairs in any way inhibited by this 1,000-foot separation?
It depends. So what you say is correct. I'm glad you asked the question. So the non-conforming rights allows for repair, like a re-roofing your house. Would allow for repair of an existing tank. Non-conforming rights wouldn't apply to any new tanks, but it would apply to potentially safety, changes to existing tanks. But there's two things. If there were any increase in the footprint, either height or, if there was any increase in any one of these tanks, then that wouldn't be repaired. So for instance, if you had a tear down, so some of the tanks are very old and, need to be replaced with more modern technology. So that would mean a bigger tank in order to accommodate the same amount of fuel, and that type of safety upgrade, or that, rebuilding one of these would, one, not necessarily be allowed. It would, so if you wanted to take down one of the old tanks and replace it, the code says if you damage more than 50% of the structure, then you have to rebuild it according to code. So unless you get this approval through, and there's a very strict approval criteria. So if you take away one tank and replace it with a new, more modern tank that is the same exact size, of course it would carry less fuel, right? Then you may be able to get that approved. But any increase in size would strictly not be allowed without obtaining a variance for the encroachment into the 1,000 feet and then a conditional use review. So the answer to your question, some repairs are allowed. Anything beyond that, any increase is not governed by non-conforming rights. You're into the whole new code.
But what we heard is you're changing insulation on the pipe, this routine thing, to do it annually. My understanding is you're good to go. It doesn't matter what this code says. Routine maintenance on your...
Well, and they're also talking about digging up pipes under the ground and making them above ground.
That part may be different, but your routine maintenance.
And so, from our understanding, thank you for the question, from our understanding, it's because we have to remove so much of the old pipe and then put on the new coating that would actually qualify as construction of that pipeline. So, so that's where some of this ambiguity lies, because there's so much removal and replacement of that pipe, that project itself is really in a sort of a gray area. But the digging up of the other pipelines and replacing it with a newer, safer, above ground pipeline would definitely fall into this maintenance.
On the section B, the end, it says you added in the I1 and I2 districts. And then, did you write this?
Yeah, this is my amendments.
So the then you better add GI1, CP1, 2, 3, actually. CPR, CPR.
Mr. Chair, that's not quite correct. It's critical that the way it's written remain. What this does is, that this phrase at the top of B is needed in order to continue to have the MI district, or the Marine Industrial District, not have the conditional use requirement. That's what that does. The Girdwood has its own standalone code, so whatever that says about bulk storage of hazardous material or fuel tanks would govern. It's its own standalone chapter.
Okay, is this it's not discussed in their chapter 9 or chapter 10, then you default to the rest of the code. So their table says it doesn't address it, but separation, but it doesn't. I don't know if those chapters mention the separation. So my sense is that we default to this house with separation. That's not correct. What's the separation required in Girdwood?
Well, if there's not a use-specific stand, which there's not, then they have the same 1,000 foot. And this doesn't speak to the Girdwood Industrial District. But what would be applicable is their table of allowed uses, and whether or not that has a use type related to bulk storage of hazardous material. So it's a good question. I can do more research on that. I can look up the chapter right now, but this ordinance is aimed specifically at the Port of Anchorage.
I just don't want to create a...
You don't want to change
Sure. But it's suggested to be.
So I do have a floor amendment that I would recommend to the Assembly. So I prepared a floor amendment which changes 3 words to make it very clear that public notification with our proposed administrative site plan review is required. That's all that this does.
So hand it out.
Yeah, let's do that. And I've got 35 copies here, so we'll just hand it to everybody. Well, I want to make sure that everyone sees the tree is back.
2 trees and 4.
So, in answer to your question, let me take a look at the Girdwood Code, Mr. Chair, and we'll make sure that the existing wording is easy to overlook. In Eagle River. Well, yeah, this definitely affects Eagle River because their table of allowed uses is kind of built on ours. It uses.
Okay, so you want to change. Do you want to go through this?
Sure, I actually handed out every copy I had in mind, but thank you. The old version said, except in the I2 district within the Port of Anchorage security area, which shall require administrative which shall require administrative site plan approval. I changed it to administrative site plan review with notice. With notice is the key that ensures that there will be public notification. That's the blue posters notifying people of a case affecting the petition site, mailers that we send in the mail notifying people of the case, and of course they're always routed to the community council, put up on our website, and e-alerts are sent out to everyone who is signed up for them.
So notice, that's in your, when you say notice, that's in your procedures.
Chapter 3 specifies what with notice means.
And it means within 500 feet of the chain, which would...
And to a minimum of 50 properties.
Community council.
The community council is routed on every application the planning department receives.
What's the difference between review and approval?
it's interchangeable. I mean, it was phrased that originally you have to have administrative site plan approval. I changed it to be more accurate and in keeping with the grammar and the rest of the code, which is administrative site plan review is required with notice. But so that approval and review means nothing. They have to get approved. That means with the key, you can change it back to approval. The key is this floor amendment is to add the two words with notice.
I get that. Just changes the other ones.
Yeah.
Understand that.
We have to review before you can approve it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it means. Yeah, what Mr. Rossi said. Okay.
I'd like to get on with here and
Okay, so Chair.
Yeah, just very briefly, and then I'm going to hand it over.
Because we're recording this.
Yeah, I'm Melinda Gant, Government Hill Community Council President. I'm going to just briefly discuss how this all came about. And then I'm going to hand it over to Steve Gorlick, who's put together a presentation for the group, so we don't hold everybody any longer than we need to. During the month of February, Greg from Crowley, who's one of our business partners, approached the Government Hill Community Council that they wanted to add a truck rack. The council's fully supported them. So there was an unintended consequence that nobody was aware of. And so at the end of March, I got a call or an email from Steve or Sharon, I believe it was, I'm not sure who, that they needed to do a quick meeting, and they didn't really say what it was about. So so we met April 3rd. We had a brief meeting with some port folks and Stephanie Kessler, who is past president, and myself, and they approached us about an ordinance change. The ordinance change is different from what's presented to you. The ordinance change was just to remove, period, the 1,000-foot buffer for all industrial zones. It had nothing to do with just the port. Two, removing the process of review, changing it to an administrative process. Stephanie and our immediate reaction was we can't have just this discussion about Government Hill, because removing the 1,000-foot buffer also affects other communities, and there needs to be other council presidents involved with this discussion. So we continued the discussion, and we knew that as a community, we wanted to not hamper Crowley's truck rack. So I suggested to the group, and that's how this all came about, I suggested to the group, let's just make this about the port so that we can proceed forward with the Crowley truck racks. We don't want to hamper what they need to do for their business. And so we called a second meeting, and that second meeting was held April 10th at the port office. And we went and reviewed basically the ordinance and the proposal of just making it the port area. And how this came about was a discussion with Stephanie and I, and this was a big issue for us. So for the group, this is street level. And Steve will go into the history of this, but we used to have these up here. And there's some history about that safety concern. So we said absolutely the community is just going to have issues with the street level tanks. They're hazardous, close to, as you can see, and then this is the school property and the AT&T property. So we hampered that down, and then the second thing that probably came up as a big contention, I think, not contention, but concern, was the change of the process of review. I know that Stephanie in particular was really trying to work with the port, but she had some concerns as well on the review process and taking it out of a public process. So we understand that there's an unintended consequence with the 1,000-foot buffer, but I do want to point out to you, to the group, the history of Government Hill was, we started here in 1915 with the rail. This was an unintended consequence, the tanks. This came out in the 40s. So what we're trying to do now is work as a business community and in a residential community, and how these existing tanks can continue doing their operations, but any growth here, we don't want to have more unintended consequence to creation of a death zone that Steve will talk about with you. And I'm going to hand this over to Steve now.
Thank you.
Bradley. I just two quick things. One, Melinda, is it accurate? The school is not on the on that map that you were pointing to. That's the.
This is school?
That's the school, yeah.
And this is the main communication center for the state of Alaska.
When you had pointed to the buildings in the other map, you mentioned the school. I just want to clarify where the
Thank you.
Yeah, and then that green hashed area on the map that she's pointing to, that was the area of concern.
This one?
Yeah, that's the platted limited development area. So they have a deed restriction on the property and a plat note specifying that area you can't build tanks. So that's not an area where tanks are allowed, regardless of what the zoning says. Okay, it's a deed limitation. It's a platted. It's not a no development zone. It allows for roads, but it doesn't allow any structures, is what the actual plat language says. So I just want to clarify those two things, and I'm sorry.
Okay. Steve, what's your last name?
Gerlich, Gerlek, resident of Government Hill.
Okay, thanks.
And I'm speaking for the house.
All right, go ahead.
All right. So I've got a handout here. This is what we'll flip through. Probably take about 10 minutes. Definitely answer questions as you go. So the top relates to, we've already heard this, but and it's also important to note that this ordinance or this amendment relates to bulk storage of hazardous materials, including liquid fuels. On the next page is the definition, a very quick definition of what hazardous materials are. You can see highlighted there, there are things that pose a significant health and safety hazard, and there's lists here. Many people have these in their garage, but what we're talking about here is very large quantities of this, like industrial quantities of these materials. On the next page, these are the 4 characteristics that make these hazards. These are the characteristics recognized by industry, government, regulators. Large quantities are hazardous because of, for the first one is blast shock wave. If these things explode, they create a shock wave, and what we're looking at here is a scale of consequences. So as you move to the right, you can see if you're standing next to this thing, you would be killed. And then there's a zone of injury, there's a zone of evacuation for safety, and there's a zone of safety. Whereas if you're in the safe zone, you're not being impacted by the blast. Below is radiant heat, and you can see the consequence zones there too. There's a building there that's been scarred by that. On the next page is ballistic shrapnel. It's pretty easy to understand, that's just flying debris. And then toxic releases. Each one of these has a zone of fatality, injury, evacuation, and safety. So we're on page 4 now, and we're going to just summarize a few of the quick rules for hazardous materials in industrial settings, and then we'll move on to residential settings. So the current practice here on the top, if you have a new facility, so on the left side is a new tank farm, you've got your fatality or injury zone, and what you do is you set back control rooms, maintenance shops, construction break areas, base camps where people sleep, you put them in a safe area so they're set back and not of consequence. Now there are times when maybe you're on an island, maybe you're on an offshore platform, maybe geography constrains you, and that's down at the bottom on a retrofit. And what you do is 2 things. You upgrade the safety equipment to minimize the chance of an accident, and you put barriers between that and the people. These could be blast hardening of buildings, these could be thermal barriers, these could be secure ventilation to protect the people. I'm a retired project manager from BP, 33 years. One of my last jobs was facility siting on the North Slope. It's $1 billion project to address these concerns on the North Slope. When we constructed the facilities in the 70s and the 80s, this was not part of how we were thinking. We had control rooms, we had people right next to kit, process the fuel tanks. BP learned the very hard way around the world that accidents happen, and it's unacceptable to have people sleeping next to these facilities, and it's the right thing to do. Next page is just a summary of the reasons. There are tragic lessons. If you take a look at some of these here, even the best engineering systems fail. NASA failed a couple of times. People were too close. We now have the math. Thanks to 9/11, the 2 Iraq wars, IEDs, we can analyze in very precise mathematical detail how far shrapnel goes, what it does when it impacts people, blast radiuses, as well as thermal radiation. Society has evolved. We have a lot more better educated people now, and there's a lot less tolerance for risk, especially the transfer of risk to vulnerable people from somebody else. And it's the law. This relates to oil fields, chemical plants, refineries, fertilizer factories, and those sorts of things. Let's take a look at residential settings on page 6. So as was mentioned, Government Hill started in the 1915s, and there's a picture there. You can see permanent settlement starting on the bluff. By the 40s, the bluff was fully developed. There was a fully functioning neighborhood up there, and we started having hazardous materials in the port. And probably at that time, the city fathers were rather pleased with how things were developing and that they were becoming a big city on the edge of the frontier. By the 1960s, the port and the city was aggressively pursuing bulk fuel storage. After the earthquake, they incentivized companies not to rebuild in Seward and Valdez, to bring it here to pay off a bond. And that was also the time of the first significant fire. And then in the 2000s, we had the Williams Brothers fires in Lower Grand. So in the first 20 years, we had 27 reported spills and accidents, including a fatality at Defense Fuels, a 1 million gallon spill. And then in the next 20 years, the last 20 years, we had 63 reported spills. So on page 7 is where we are today. 85 storage tanks, 150 million gallons of fuel, 7 rail, truck, marine loading facilities, and zones of injury and fatality that have been pushed into the neighborhood by this industrial creep. Starting in the 9 o'clock position, we'll go clockwise. So there was a hazard study in 2002 that showed that there was a zone of fatality in the neighborhood, which is the red line, bordering on Delaney Street, and a zone of injury, which is the yellow line. And then the Crowley study showed that with an incident at their facilities, the bluff would catch on fire. Then we've got the new potential tanks here, and the 2015 port conservation exercise showed that the entire neighborhood would be evacuated. So how we got here was incremental development, not viewed as a whole, one at a time. Zoning separation for residences is for firefighting. It's enough space to get an equipment through to put the fire out, not to protect the residents of the occupants next to them. So eventually, Government Hill ended up where we were, sleeping next to these fuel tanks. And this would not be permitted on the North Shore. Future expansion. So let's do the math here. HUD has a website and a tool on it for screening projects, so all the math is done behind the scene. You can see in red here with existing dikes, the first red line there is the thermal radiation limit for buildings, and then the second red line is the thermal radiation limit for people. So all of West Government Hill right now is ineligible for HUD-funded projects. With this development up in the yellow area, you can see what that does is it makes the school, our business district, and basically the whole heart of Government Hill ineligible. Let's look at some other cities. Page 9. So this is Portland. You see the pictures on the left? There are a lot of cities on the Northwest that have the same problem that we do. Industry has grown up, neighborhoods have grown up. But when you look at the map here, Portland is so big now, what has happened is they've got a half a dozen or so of these right next to neighborhoods. They had 2 years of study, numerous public hearings, hundreds of people testifying in a 73-page technical document that came out. And what they recommended and passed just recently was to classify these areas as urban bulk fuel terminal sites, anything over 2 million gallons. They've grown up inside the city. What they had done was they grandfathered these facilities. It's fair to businesses. They can keep doing their business there. They can do safety upgrades. They're very concerned about seismic like we are. All seismic upgrades are possible. It's just they can't make them any bigger and increase the risk to the neighborhoods. So we go to Alabama. So the way that city evolved is on the side of the river closest to us here, we see the residential, the office, public gathering places, the parks. And across the river is where industrial development happened. They had 5 years of study with an impressive group of people, academics, scientists, lawyers, subject matter experts testifying. And that group recommended a half-a-mile setback. And of course, through politics, what was eventually approved was 1,500 feet. Again, grandfathered all the businesses in here, can still continue the business. It's only fair to them. It's also fair to the residents if there's no growth and you allow the safety upgrades to occur. Let's take a look at Anchorage and Cook Avenue. So when you step back and you look up here, what's happening now on Defense Fuels, They relocated to base to the uplands. They've got a fuel storage tank up there, which is much safer seismically. That would be perfectly suited. Across the inlet, you've got lots and lots of area for an increase. And in Anchorage, you've got outside the buffer and all of the grandfathered inside the buffer. And here we've actually had a 30-year public process and discussion about this. Let me just quickly run through that for you. In 87, the Defense Fuels, so there was a small effort to increase Susan Nightingale Park to allow tourists and neighbors to just look at the port operations. A lot of interesting things are going on. Defense Fuel wrote back to us, we can't support this because in 1977, a former employee of Defense Fuels was killed due to a ignition source caused by a piece of equipment approximately 100 feet from the tank. My concern is that we could again suffer a similar catastrophe involving tourists and neighbors. And I said, oh, by the way, we don't want you having barbecues in your front yard while we're loading our tanks. And there was a collective lots from there. That was the beginning of our learning. And if you've been around here, you remember probably the VOC and the benzene issues. They were way higher than any federal and state regulations. And so vapor control had to be brought on these tanks. Senator Stevens eventually was able to close and relocate the ones on, like Melinda said, that are on the top of the bluff there. And then in 1996, 20 years ago now, there was an ordinance proposed for 1,000-foot setback. P&Z reviewed it, and here is from Sheila Silkrick, Dr. Sheila Silkrick. Here is her review of that, where she actually did the math. She calculated herself, and her recommendation was to approve 1,000-foot setback. And that the conditional use was an appropriate issue here because bulk storage is an extremely hazardous is a public safety issue. What we do to politics, it was actually voted down. There was a lawsuit by the council against, it turns out that the Meissner administration had prevented city staff from testifying in front of the assembly, including the fire department and city inspectors. And there were 26 documents withheld from the public. The council actually won, got a monetary settlement for legal fees, and the city was required to do training on First Amendment rights to be able to testify. Then Mayor Wersch, very conservative mayor, actually commissioned a hazard study that demonstrated that there were fatality zones, that enough of this had creeped into causes. Then we had the conflagration study that showed the evacuation, and then the problem. And finally, 30 years later, we have the 1,000-foot safety buffer put in place. And the ink's not even dry. And here we are talking about pushing it back. And so on page 12, we've got what's been proposed, the collapse of the safety buffer in a very important area, administrative ruling, which is much less of involvement of the public to talk about these important things for their families and their homes, and characterize this as a minor technical change. Page 13 is, we won't get into this, but this is just the difference between conditional and administrative review. And you can see that conditional use permit requires a lot of thought, subject matter experts to come in and talk about these important issues. And then 14 and 15 shows the separation distances, existing separation distances, and then what would happen if this were to occur. And finally, we have the council resolution. So from the neighborhood's perspective, it was not an unintended consequence. It was a feature. It wasn't a bug. It was an important safety buffer. It brings us up to speed with current thought on how cities, smart cities, ought to progress. And this is a regression.
Questions? It's really impressive.
Yes, well, it's such an important, well, I lived there for 30 years. But this is a huge issue for this community. And I'm not sure this has been explained enough to our representatives. We always get the industrial viewpoint, which is fine. Government Hill works with it. We want them to be successful. But we want the balance to be safe as well. And it seems like as a minimum, grandfathering those and letting them operate, like that's fine, we're okay with that. But allowing more to stack in when there's plenty of room in Alaska just doesn't seem to make sense.
questions?
Francis, question off of that.
Can we go with Francis real quick? Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What Steve said about Portland, that all may be accurate. When I contacted Portland Planning Department, they explained to me and showed me in their code that there is no zoning restriction of any kind on their fuel storage. It's just that it be in an industrial zone. But separately, that city has passed a law prohibiting new fuel tanks because of their global climate change goals. So it wasn't, the way that they explained it to me is that zoning doesn't restrict, fuel tanks with 1,000-foot separation distance or with a conditional use permit. It's a permitted by right use in their industrial districts. But there will be no new fuel tanks because they, the kayakers on the port, and that they don't. There was protests in the city. They don't want new fuel tank because they're in favor of anti-global climate change.
No, was that a safety? What's the seismic record for this? I understand that they're like us. They're in a seismic area, and all these were built with liquefaction stores. So there was a number. It wasn't just kayakers. They were health professionals.
I'd like to, what we'll do is we'll go around, and then, so if you have something to say, just say it. We'll work our way around it instead of goes back and forth. We got 24 minutes to solve this.
I was having my hand.
Mr. Chair, one other comment to add is in response to the presentation is, I think the question is, we're all in favor of safety for the neighborhood. These are all valid and important concerns, but should this be part of the zoning should it be a zoning requirement that there's separation distance, or should this be reviewed as it is already by fire department, by Coast Guard, by DEC, by our structural building reviewers, architectural reviewers who review for all of these sorts of hazards? That already occurs. When we survey other communities, we don't find that there's zoning restrictions in most cases, that it's a part of the normal building permit fire review. That's the planning department's position, moving or finding a compromise. We view this ordinance as a compromise. We're not completely rolling back to the way that the old code said. We're still allowing for the administrative site plan review with the two new standards of approval. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, George. Yeah. So I have a question for Steve and for Francis, and then another question for the community council. So in this presentation, he has this graphic of a number of new fuel tanks being built next to the neighborhood. Are there actually plans to do that? What are the prospects of those 12 new fuel tanks being built?
Has interest been expressed in constructing fuel tanks down at the port? Yes, it has, by two different companies not present on the port right now. Is one of them in that vicinity? Yes. At the top of the bluff? Not a chance. It's hard to see, but the contours on that follow what Francis had said. There's a 65 to 75 foot difference in the height between the top of the bluff and the bottom of the bluff. And we would suggest, and I think any geotechnical studies, none of which have been done yet, would favor the bottom of the bluff before they favor the top of the bluff anyway. And we've been at every community council meeting for probably the last 8 or 9 years, and appreciate what the concerns of the community are. And I think we've been pretty upfront with everything that is planned to be done down at the port, and will continue to be that way. We've got to live there too, so we're really not of a mind where we don't want to make things complicated for anybody.
Thanks. So my follow-up on that with I'm sorry, with Steve. So you guys talked about other locations where they have grandfather clauses. Would the proposed work that Tesoro was talking about, not new fuel tanks, but daylighting a pipeline, doing other kinds of safety upgrades, would that be grandfathered as well?
I'm not an expert in the law, but we assumed it would be, and we're very much in favor of that. We would encourage that.
Okay. Thank you.
And then just one other thing on the heat rises. The bluff is not protected.
How many people were at the community council meeting where this resolution was approved?
Sure. Off the top of my head, I think there were 16 approval. We had like 2 or 3 that abstained, including Stephanie Kessler because she sits on the Burke Commission. Is that correct?
Right.
And then of course we have our business partners who also abstained.
Except for Crawley. Except for Crawley.
Except for Crawley. And Crawley was the one in favor because of course Greg wants to see his truck racks go in, and we do as well.
When we have the assembly meeting on Tuesday, you'll have 5 minutes. If you send somebody to represent the community council, we'll give you 5 minutes for testimony.
Thank you.
That's all. I just want all of us to recognize this is really 2 different questions here, right? You're addressing the safety factors with a 1,000-foot buffer. You're also putting out an argument that we shouldn't allow expansion of tanks in the port.
In buffer zone.
Right, and so I just want to be clear that I'm seeing 2 different issues presented in this document. So to me, they're very separate.
Right, and those are the existing ones.
Right, very separate issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm looking at page 8, and we've got the new yellow proposed additional tanks. I'm wondering where exactly is the bluff in relation to where these yellow tanks are?
The map on the wall, Mr. Peterson, shows some topo lines, and there's some numbers on that. There's a line, let's see here. I see 108 feet here and down to 36 feet with this line. So it's not a great map, but.
So where exactly? Is the bluff right along there, or are these up at the same elevation as the?
I think the bluff runs kind of like that. That this is like the community's been saying.
On that chart there, yeah, they're off the chart.
Oh yeah, it's up here, right?
2 o'clock.
Yeah, it's up here, right?
If you look at the photograph, the green hashed area has...
This is the best map for
this,
this, yeah.
That is the top of the bluff. It falls off steeply from there. The whole reason that line is where it is because it's the top of the bluff that would impact viewshed.
That's street side.
Yeah.
And it wasn't viewshed was never brought up in any of our meetings, nor at the community council. I know that the planning department brought that up, but really our 2 major concerns was safety, which 1,000-foot setback, and the public process.
Where that green hashed area came from, you have to go back to 2008 or 9 when the Army transferred that property that used to be the Defense Fuels property. When that was deeded to the municipality, part of that quitclaim deed requires the port to do no vertical construction within that green hashed area. And that was, if you go back and look at the ordinance that the Assembly approved for the land transfer, that's stated in there in language that area there would not, no vertical construction would occur in that area.
Because of viewshed.
Because of viewshed.
But the bottom line is it's basically the top of the bluff. It falls off quickly right after that.
Thanks.
No, I already know.
Okay, I'm sorry, thank you.
We get mixed up all the time. You know why you're laughing?
Well, they sit next to each other at the study meetings. What do you expect?
So I want to go back to, Francis, you said there was a study done in which there was a determination of the actual hazard zones, and at one point you mentioned 200 feet. Could you just give us a quick recap of what exactly that they evaluated?
So Crowley looked at their sorry. Yeah, Crowley looked at did a I should read the title. Crowley Port of Anchorage Fuel Terminal Fire Hazard Calculations, 100% submittal. This is a study that I've read that it has a summary page here, but it looks at the hazards of catastrophe with their tanks, and it shows the very small, relatively footprint of the hazards, the health hazards that are caused by these tanks. The limitations of this is that it doesn't address the tanks of other companies and other parts of the toe of the bluff. But this kind of map gives you a sense, and we can make this available. I'd like to send this study to all of you for consideration.
I think that would be helpful. I'll just say it, I'm not privy to emotional arguments, and so when I hear somebody point to a 1,000-foot buffer or the whole map and say that it's a death zone, I want to see the numbers to back it up.
Oh, I didn't say it's a death zone, for clarification.
I wrote down death zone.
Yes, when the Crowley study, this right here is an immediate death zone.
So, and for clarity, it's not a debate. This is an opportunity for us each to speak. And my point is as I'm looking at this, number one, first and foremost, in my mind is public safety, right? But that's why I asked for actual studies and to look at what is the math behind it and what is the history. So I liked the area where Mr. Gerlich was going when he was talking about, the fatality zone, the injury zone, the evacuation zone. But for me, this does nothing because it doesn't talk about the specific tanks that we're talking about. And it doesn't give me how far. It just shows me red, more red, yellow, and green. And so to me, I'm looking for a quantifiable number of what is the distance. So to me, that's not really helpful. And then when I look for some of the history around it, I do appreciate it. And as I've heard today, this tank farm has changed and expanded over the years, there's no question. But it was originally built by the presentation, started back in the 40s. And you've lived there for about 30 years.
Right.
So obviously it was known hazard when you moved in. It doesn't diminish the risk. So that's why I want to go back to the study, and I think it's important. I think it's important to do that. So for me, I try to get through, on all topics, I try to get through the emotional arguments, which is hard because it's at home, right? And we're talking about public safety, and we're hearing different messages. When we hear the people talking about the improvements to the tanks, whether it's bringing pipe above ground, changing tanks, taking out some older tanks, maybe replacing them with newer technology that actually has to make a bigger tank but a safer tank for the same amount of fuel. I think we all have to step back and realize that it seems to me every side is talking about making it safer. And I do believe, from everything I've listened to today, I believe Title 21's change has been an unintended consequence. And I'm huge on public process. I don't give directors administrative review authority lightly. And I only ever think it's appropriate in very limited circumstances. But when I look at the Port of Anchorage, I see the proposed changes in fact in conflict with the safety standards the community expects. If you have somebody, in this case, Crowley, next week it could be Tesoro, who knows. But if you have somebody who's wanting to make safety upgrades, and it appears to me the argument has been made, there could be an argument the safety standards really would have to go through a whole variance process. And I don't think that's acceptable. I think that is an unintended consequence of Title 21. So I think that difference of the community is being noticed. Their comments can go into the director. The science will be reviewed. The actual project will be reviewed. I think that's appropriate. I will be supporting this amendment as it's written with the amendment. I think when we come back to discuss suburban propane, I think they might be in the same kind of situation. But what I want to make sure is that as these companies want to make safety improvements, that they can make those safety improvements without waiting a year, because what could happen in a year? I mean, the extra time and cost to get through it. But I think Chris is right. I think there's a totally separate situation we need to really consider with this downtown area. You have an existing port that has these tank farms that not only have strategic importance to the state of Alaska, but frankly to our military base, which is of national importance. But you also have a neighborhood who's housed right next to it. So it is definitely a tricky transition area. And it's something we have to consider, but for this topic specifically, I think this is absolutely an oversight of Title 21, the changes to it. And council will not agree with me on that. They'll probably say that, it's on the outer side, it's exactly what we wanted, but I can tell you from watching the adoption of Title 21, I wasn't on the body when they adopted it. I don't remember one conversation where people say we couldn't make safety improvements or we couldn't upgrade our tanks without going through this variance process. And so to me, if that would have came up, I think you would have had a different outcome. So I'll be supporting the amendment and the ordinance.
Thank you. Rick?
Yep, so the lines on the map come from this study here, which did the map, so it didn't include that in it, but it came from that. And I'd just like to note that Crowley's study has not been peer reviewed. As you can imagine, the map is pretty specific and detailed. There are a lot of insurance companies that do this as well, and generally on these sort of modeling, you have a check. And has been done on this. Or they did state that, at least in their view, the bluff would catch on fire, and the house nearby facing it is going to be a fire.
I don't envy you. I wouldn't live next to a water tank, so, I mean, seriously. Right. I mean, I don't envy you. I mean,
well, this was a discovery by the neighborhood, too. I mean, there was a lot of people that really didn't understand this, and society didn't understand this either, and we're not alone. We saw Portland, we saw Mobile, Alabama, and you're very right. This interface can be very hard to deal with. There's legitimate business issues.
Yeah, you've referenced a few documents that I haven't seen. Are there electronic versions of those available?
I believe we have an electronic version of this. We could make those available.
So could you please get them to me soon?
Yeah.
Okay, I just make kind of a little bit different than Amy. I worry that we've seen a number of things come forward that are stated as unintended consequences of Title 21, and I sometimes get the sense that, this is doesn't let us do what we want to do. It must be unintended then. And I would debate that because I've sat in this room for hundreds of hours as every single line of this new code was discussed by 2 planning and zoning commissions, and I don't think a word was missed. So when they said 1,000 feet, someone read that and chose not to discuss it if it wasn't discussed, or it was discussed. And we can see, and I wasn't aware that it was proposed 10, 20 years ago. So the 1,000 feet is not just some random number. That was in here. So is that unintended consequence? I don't see it in any way, shape, or form. Is it a problem for the port right now? Absolutely. Have you made a good case that you kind of sort of need to do some stuff that this gets in the way? Sure. But this code's been in effect for 16 months. You could have got your conditional use. You could have got your variances in that time. More money, more time, stinks. No one likes it, but that's the code. And everyone doing every project in town runs into code things because, well, you kind of need to provide parking for your people. We're an ugly city if we cut down every tree. These things are in here for a good reason. So maybe 1,000 is wrong, but do we short-circuit the system because this is a hassle for you? And I'm not inclined to go there. You could have gone through the process. We can still go through the full process. We might land this place, but to short-circuit the system because all of a sudden you go, whoops, that's a problem. But also saying, if we are going to short-circuit the system, it should be in as minimal a way as possible, not chuck the whole thing. And I would say, let's clarify that safety improvements would be allowed. Okay, that seems like a no-brainer. Okay, and I would question whether or not some of the things you proposed would be not allowed without you even coming to anyone. Go get your permits to re-insulate your pipes or whatever. You're good. So, and I think the new gas station pipes, whatever you want to put in, if that's weightier, you do have other. That's not the only place to get fuel out of these tanks. There are alternatives until you went through the whole process. So, I'm struggling saying this is a hassle, so we're going to call it unintended consequence. I just don't see evidence of that at all. And are we concerned about 1,000 feet? Well, we just passed last meeting, or the one before, a pesticide ordinance where you can't spray herbicides in our parks because people worry about this stuff. It's very important to people in the city. So here we're going, but hazardous waste might be fuel, might be herbicides, who knows? We're okay with that being near a neighborhood. I don't think the community's there. We showed it by, I don't know what the vote was on the herbicide ordinance in the past. So anyway, so I'm not convinced here that this warrants the extreme result that we have in front of us. Maybe a smaller package that says
This is not short-circuiting the system. It's not. This is, I was there, I watched it, I know you were, and all the time. 11 members on the assembly, also the same thing. You know what, there's gonna be things that we know we don't know, that we're gonna come up against, that we are gonna create a mechanism, a process to bypass planning and zoning review to allow for changes for things that we didn't think about. This was never discussed. I never remember this discussion coming up. And so it's not fair to say it's a short circuit of the process or going around the process. This is the process the assembly effectively set up to deal with issues that come up that they couldn't predict. And I'll just push back on some of the unintended consequences of Title 21. Because people like to throw it out there like, oh, this isn't really unintended. Well, when they pass zoning and land use and window requirements, all these different things where they accidentally made it so an entire industry couldn't build more than a one-story house with a flat roof on a certain percentage of a slope, that was an unintended consequence. Nobody thought of it. And I don't think anybody thought about, okay, so the port might want to bring some pipes up like above ground, spray them with new foam. They might want to rebuild, 40% of a particular structure. That might actually have to go through a variance. I don't think anybody thought about that. I don't remember that discussion. You were in more of the meetings than I was, but I don't remember that. So again, by calling this a short circuit of the system, I mean, I personally I think it's wrong. And I think it's wrong because I remember listening to the assembly. You were on the assembly. I remember listening to the discussion about, listen, there's things we know we don't know. We have to create a mechanism to fix those and not take a year to do it.
So, Amy, you saying you have to pass something and know what's in it?
No. I
actually agree with you. I just wanted you to know for the record that Amy and Nancy Pelosi are in firm agreement on this.
I cannot say that. I said I watched the assembly, I watched the discussion, and that's what they said. So, Mr. Kearney.
Title 21 was an evolving process. It took us 10 years. We could have put down another 10 years, not pass it, and still be working on it. We knew when we passed it, it'd be subject to modification. We always knew that would happen. We didn't know where the modifications were, but we know that if we didn't pass it, it would just get worse. So we approved it. And now we've got to do some cleanup on it. We're going to keep finding these things.
John, go. Did you? What happened?
No, I just wanted to talk about Nancy Pelosi again. So.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, so that people know, and I wasn't here in 1996. So, but in 2002, Golder and Associates prepared a hazard study for bulk petroleum facilities in the port. Okay, so this is 2002. And it references the land use issues, along with everything else that you've discussed today. And it says that in 1996, the MOA conducted a review of bulk fuel storage zoning requirements for 10 selected cities across the U.S. And then it talks about the various issues, setbacks, landscaping, screening, height and size, all those kind of things. And then it goes on to talk about some of the setback requirements. And it talks about Long Beach, Fairbanks, Coos Bay, Denver, and Fort Collins. And as best as I can tell, the planning department at the time was working with Clarion, I believe, and they're based in Denver, and I think that's perhaps where that 1,000-foot number came from. So it wasn't just pulled out of the air. It was discussed, it was reviewed, and it's alluded to in this report. So I think that needs to be part of the discussion too, to make sure that it's not just arbitrary, that there was Golder referred to it in their 2002 evaluation report in the bulk fuel storage. So I just wanted to add that.
Everybody listen to me. Go ahead, Francis.
Okay.
John was writing.
Well, I just sort of what John said about the 1,000-foot seeming to come from that survey of other communities. When I look at that, the communities that were studied, it appears that the 1,000-foot separation was pulled out of a Denver, Colorado fire separation requirement, part of their fire code, and then placed in our zoning code. So none of those communities, other cities, they're surveyed have 1,000-foot
No,
yard
you're right.
separation. Yeah.
Right.
But they're the only place where 1,000-foot comes up with, like where does that come from? And you cite that study. It appears that it's Denver's fire code. And I think what you're trying to say is that, the new code was largely written by this consultant, Clarion, and they may have taken this report into account. Is that?
I don't know.
We don't know. That's kind of the theory we're trying to. Yeah.
It's based on some kind of analysis that's done in other communities, and that's how they arrive.
But none of them say 1,000-foot in the zone.
Okay, we're getting a little past our 11 o'clock.
I've heard reference now to the Planning and Zoning Commission. I've heard a couple times the place took a vote or had a conversation, and that wasn't presented in any of the records I saw, that they discussed and decided it was an unintended consequence.
So I've got copies of the draft minutes from the Planning and Zoning Commission's meeting. They haven't had a meeting to adopt these minutes and make them final or whatever, so it says draft on them. But these are they made a motion and approved. They made a motion finding that the proposed technical amendment was a technical amendment and was the result of an unintended consequence of the new code. And the vote, I think, was 8-1. No, it's got it. The top of page 2 is so the bottom of page 1 it begins the case, and the top of page 2 is their vote passed. Yeah.
But they are routine for what you would claim to be unintended consequence. You're just to notify them. You don't get to say, oh, it's unintended, and therefore it is. They may have said that, but they don't have a role in it.
That's exactly right, but so the planning department is required to provide notification to Planning and Zoning Commission. When we did that, they did what they weren't required to do, which is they took the step of making a motion finding that this was a technical amendment that should be set straight and simple. So they're finding that this is a technical amendment and does not need a public hearing by their body. That's what they made a motion and adopted. The vote was 8-1. It was 1 opposed. They don't, but they can still, and I read to you some of the quotes of the things that they said at the meeting. Yeah.
John, that just brings the last question. Because you mentioned that this seems to be out of the process, this whole review and revision. And so my question is, what would the normal process be if it isn't go to the Planning and Zoning Commission and come here?
The normal process is it goes to the Planning Commission, they have public hearing on it.
Well, it's a different
and then it comes to us. This is in the book for 5 years. If it's kind of errors and omissions and stuff and unintended consequences, but you kind of got to show it's an unintended consequence, not just something that we don't like.
So they got to have a public hearing. They have Planning and Zoning on the discussion.
And then in this case, a coaching would then come to us for another public hearing, similar to what they're doing now.
Can I clarify something? Because, but there's multiple processes, right? The administration has done this multiple times with other Title 21 issues. I've done it with Title 21 issues. There's 2 processes. One is you introduce an ordinance, you send it, or you can send it to Planning and Zoning before you introduce the ordinance, and they can weigh in on it. They go through their whole public hearing, all that kind of stuff. The other process is the assembly has the ability within code, whether it's an unintended consequence or not, they have the ability to waive Planning and Zoning review.
Good advice to us all.
Period. So one of the big discussions about Title 21 is when they passed it, because I wasn't on the body, when they passed it, they said, well, we know there's things we don't know. So as those things come up and we view them as an unintended consequence, we're going to bypass Planning and Zoning review and go straight to the assembly. In hopes some of those issues were to save a building season or, deal with something different. So it's not that it's a right process or a wrong process, but within code, like you could draft an amendment tomorrow to deal with the suburban propane after this discussion and say, listen, unintended consequence, you can just put your title waive Planning and Zoning review, which this admin doesn't actually say, but it says it in the context of it. So it's truly up to the discretion of the assembly member, whoever's introducing it.
Chris, there's another way around it too. I've got the language about that long. For friend of mine, Ellen,
Outstanding.
notwithstanding the provision of A and C so-and-so,
Yeah.
the assembly substitutes their own judgment in this case. There's no need to send it to P and Z.
So I guess,
Is that, my question then, is that an active process that's required, or is that something that's just assumed?
No, it's, I mean, it is, what Amy said is correct. And it's in this code, says it during the first 5 years. And so pretty much you can take any old thing, we can call it unintended consequence, but is it true? And we've had some changes recently that were, some of the steep slope ordinance.
But it will determine if it's an unintended consequence.
and frankly, it doesn't have to be an unintended consequence. If an assembly decides, no matter what the issue is, that they want to bypass planning and zoning review, they can do that.
Yeah, but it's heavy-handed. You don't want to be that way if you're helping.
It depends on the issue.
I personally love public process, but sometimes planning and zoning review takes 4 months.
Okay, so,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
for everyone here, there'll be a public hearing Tuesday, so everyone gets to speak on it. Does the committee want to make a recommendation?
I make a recommendation for approval. Let's see if anybody else is willing to join.
I can't vote on this committee.
Yeah, who's on the committee? It's Keith,
I'll second.
it's Felix, and it's Dick.
I'm not on.
Oh, you're not? Okay.
Okay, so.
You seconded it. I'm in favor of it.
Okay, so 3-1.
With modifications.
Yeah, well, and I think with the amendment.
Man, we can draft this for speed.
Okay, I think that makes us done.
So, can we tell the committee council, so what this means is the committee is making a recommendation that with the amendments that we're discussing, that this in its form go forward, but the full body still has to vote on it. It doesn't mean it's passed. So public testimony is still very important.
This committee is just a section of the committee to the assembly. All 11 members have to vote on this. So that'll be Tuesday. You'll get 5 minutes from my representative from the committee council. That doesn't mean she can have 5 minutes and you can take 3.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't get rid of that.
If everybody wants to submit the studies that they spoke about today to the clerk's office, we can make that available to all the assembly members.
That's better than handing it out the night of the meeting.
Sure.
It gives us time to read it.
And can we also submit Steve's presentation? Yes, I got a copy of that for her, so I'll.
Thank you. I have a question for the body. We were notified that there may be a work session on this topic tomorrow.
Yeah, so the determination was made that this would take the place of the
Got
work
it.
session.
So there is no work session
Yeah,
tomorrow.
it would be redundant.
Good. Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Yeah. That's what the process
No, it's fine. We let the clerk testify here, so it makes sense.